Hello, and welcome to the fire pit at the heart of the forest. At the time between times, the time it's neither night nor day, but the sun has gone and the sky is grey. The time when the veil between our world and the fairy world is wafer, wafer thin. And tonight it is even thinner than usual, as it is my joy to have with me at the fire pit at the heart of the forest the host of the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, Jo Hickey Hall. Hello, Jo, and how are you?
Hello, Owen. I'm very well indeed. Thank you.
It is so nice to have you here in this magical place, surrounded by trees and shadows, where the Tylwyth Teg flit from shadow to shadow, where tales are told. And for someone like you who has had fairy tales literally on the tip of their tongue for the last couple of years with the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, this must be a place where you truly feel at home.
Yeah, I wish I'd bought a brandy now. I didn't think this out properly. Should have bought a flask of something with me.
That's fine. We have each other to speak anyway. But I'm so glad you're here, Joe, and I'm really happy to chat with you. I mean, you're someone I've followed for quite a while on with the podcast, and I can clearly remember a few years ago just walking my dog in the woods, which is a really magical place. You've seen the photographs I often post, and listening for the first time to the Modern Fairy Sighting podcast, and thinking, wow, here is a place where these stories are now legitimized and people are able to tell them to an audience. And it has brought so many people almost out of the shadows with their own sightings and their own visions and their own things that have happened to them, which maybe even a few years ago would have been quite unusual to talk about. But now you've got this magical place. It must be something you're really proud of.
Oh, I absolutely love the project. Thank you so much for your kind words there. And equally, I remember when you reached out to me and we got to know each other through our shared interests too, and that was really lovely. And I think that's kind of the most beautiful part of this project, and particularly over the last 4 years and kind of what we've all been going through, just that sense of shared interest and community. And I don't know about you, I'm sure you find the same, but the kind of people that contact me and that I speak to are just so amazing and warm-hearted, and I couldn't think of spending the last 4 years with you know any other group of people, because I just have found it a very kind of humbling experience that people will contact, nowadays, now that the pod is kind of up and running, and people have found it in various different ways that I always like hearing about. To have someone write and say, I listened to this episode and it really spoke to me because this is what happened to me, and I haven't been able to really talk to anybody about this. So thank you for doing this. And I really know how that feels, because it certainly reminds me of when I started out and, sharing my story with people when I was collecting stories for Magical Folk, Simon Young's book, um, back in 2016. And just to sit with folk and share stories with each other was so liberating, actually. It was kind of strange because we it was quite an unusual situation, because usually it might be me telling somebody close to me that felt I could trust, that hopefully you might understand. But I hadn't really spoken to anyone who'd had their own experiences. So I do remember for myself what that was like to hear someone else tell their story and just be like, yeah, it might not
Well,
be the same, but it's the same as my own. But there was a flavour to it that I recognised.
yeah, and you're from Jersey, yeah, which is you're the only person I know from Jersey, which is I've never been to Jersey, but I know it's a magical place. There are so many stories, there are so many legends, there are so many. Um, it's a little bit isolated, so it has that sort of almost magic air to it that you hear about so much. When you were growing up there, did you always have an interest in the supernatural, or was there a moment or something that awakened that in you and got you down in on this road which you travel now?
Yeah, that's interesting because just from as far back as I can remember, it's not like I had an interest in the supernatural. I kind of lived it, to be honest with you. From a really early age, I was having interesting experiences that I thought were normal, that I thought everybody had those kinds of experiences. And it was always like that. But I particularly, when I think about my relationship with the supernatural, as it were, there are a couple of sources that provided a sense of what that other world might look and feel like. And one was my dad's bedtime stories. He's Irish. He's no longer with us, sadly. He died in 2014. Um, and so he used to tell me these. He had a brilliant imagination. He was amazing, and he had actually had his own experiences, which you know he he told just me and my mum about, actually. Didn't really talk about them to people, um, but he had this fantastic imagination, and I do not know where he got these stories from. I have a sense, and I can't remember where I found out at some point that these stories had been passed down the family, and I tried to ask my uncle about this before he passed away a couple of years back. And I haven't been able to get to the bottom of it, but I hope someday through my older cousins I might be able to find out, because these were such potent stories about usually what would happen in the stories that a child would be playing with their siblings or playing with other children. And because he was telling me about his own childhood where he grew up in rural Cork. He was born in mid 1930s, and it was a very poor area actually that he grew up in. And they didn't have toys as such, but they used to make their own fun and go out, into the lanes playing. And anyway, so it's kind of like the basis of the story would be that a young child would be out playing, and then it would get to sort of twilight time, get to dusk, and they'd have lost their way, and they would suddenly find themselves near a fairy fort, and they would hear the words of their, older brothers or sisters or family saying, beware, beware the fairies, and, don't go in the fairy fort. And he would tell me about these particular circles in the grass, these, where a patch of grass was darker within the circle than the outside of the surrounding area. And how this child would find themselves sort of sitting in that circle, and kind of adventures that would take place from there, and that they would meet the fairies. And I don't remember them being, they weren't kind of cutesy stories. They weren't terrifying either. And they were good stories, and you don't get enough of that nowadays. Um, yeah, I bought a book for my daughter in a charity shop while we were in Cork a couple of years ago, and it's blimmin' brilliant. It's so good, and it's all modern writers, and it's all kind of takes on, um, you know, sort of traditional folklore, but with that darker twist, and it's for kids. It's so well done, and perhaps I'll let you know the name of that so you can
Mm.
share it with people. But yeah, these stories would send me off to sleep, and goodness knows what I dreamt. Took me to places, I'm sure. And the other source would have been Enid Blyton's The Enchanted Wood, The Folk of the Faraway Tree. And Dad read me those too. And we also got read those at school in the school canteen. So while we were having our lunch. So and I loved this idea of this ancient tree in the forest and the children that would, you know, go off to play in the woods, and they would meet the fairy folk there and go off on all these adventures. So that was kind of my link with fairies as a kid, but I definitely was not a sort of, I never really dressed up as fairies or played fairies or had fairy toys or wands or anything like that. Nothing like that. It really sort of didn't. Although I continued to, love Blighton and read those fairy tales to my own kids. I was never kind of into fairies, but I was in my teens. I was into sort of more esoteric stuff. Yeah, rather than fairy stuff, things like crystals to begin with, and dreams and things like that.
You've been known for many years, like you say, you were writing with Simon Young and some research you've done as well. And in the folklore community, you've always been around that area. I know it, like a lot of us and you've talked about it a lot on your show about a sort of an awakening, a sort of a creative awakening, if you like, amongst the community, and the way that some of us are being drawn to our roots and things
Yeah.
that we really enjoy. And I believe this was one of the catalysts for the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast. It was must have been a big leap for you, someone who did a lot of research, a lot of writing, to actually take that leap to have a podcast where you would interview people who had fairy sightings in the way that you do it. How did that come about? I know that you'd done a bit of on the fairy project before, but how did you? When was the moment you decided to do that?
Well, that was really strange because I had come to Bristol to study a master's. I'll try and make this as kind of as concise as possible. Um, I'd come over in 2014. I'd been very lucky. I'd got a scholarship from Jersey to study a master's in history. But while I was in Jersey, my first degree had been it had a sort of social research focus. So I had kind of been doing my own bits of social research while doing other jobs for local government and things like that in Jersey. Um, and I loved social research, absolutely loved it. That was just, yeah, that was definitely my preferred way of approaching subjects, is to actually ask people. And when I came to Bristol, I was wanting to look at ritual in ancient sites. That's kind of what I thought I was going to come and study. And when I met Professor Ronald Hutton, because I was taking one of his modules, Pagan Studies, I think it was Ancient and Modern Pagan Studies or something like that. Anyway, it was fantastic to be able to, study with one of my heroes, if you like,
Mm,
people that I've been
mm.
following. And it was actually Ronald that said to me, why don't you have a look at the medieval Irish fairies, the Sidhe? So, I kind of got catapulted into that world, because I then joined the Folklore Society, went along to a conference, met Mark Norman. Mark knew that I was researching fairies, and asked me to join him in writing the Devon chapter for that book, Magical Folk. So while we were writing that, we thought it would be a really good twist to actually speak to people about modern encounters, because this was a kind of very academic take. The book was written by a series of contributors, mostly from academic backgrounds, but quite a few of us in that book included real life encounters that they had managed to track down. And, for me, as someone that had had my own experience of seeing a fairy, which Ronald did not know anything about, by the way, so it's just even more interesting that he kind of pushed me towards that area,
Mm.
because that wasn't an area that I would have looked at. Um, so I was very excited to further that, to kind of pick up the social research again, but to look at these experiences. I'd really enjoyed talking to people about their experiences for the book, and I just wanted to continue that. So I came back to Bristol, started up the Modern Fairy Sightings Facebook group. That started to grow, and it was fantastic. I was speaking to people, just interviewing them purely for research purposes. I wasn't sure actually what I was going to do with that, I this is the thing with how I found, my life really is that it's kind of breadcrumbs. You never really see the full picture of what's ahead. You're just, for me, I'm kind of intuitively doing the things that I really love doing and that I'm drawn to do, and I kind of just trust that. And then suddenly the next part of it's revealed, and the next part of it's revealed. So it's not like I ever set out to say, right, I'm going to do study fairies and do this. That's not happened like that at all. So what happened was, I thought that these experiences would probably form part of a PhD, because I knew that I wanted to look into this further. And then in 2020, March 2020, lockdown happened. And like many of us, as you say, something shifted. Big shift. Fated sort of shift. And I knew that I would need to look after myself during this period. We have a really young child and two older, sort of more grown-up ones. And I had work, and I had this project, which was nothing to do with my day job at the time. And so I knew that I had a lot kind of going on, and if we were going to get through that period, and support my family, I would need to look after myself. So I started doing this 21-day abundance, Deepak Chopra well-being. It's like a sort of chainmail thing that came around on WhatsApp, and a few of my friends were doing it, and they were saying how good it was. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll do that. So it meant that I was meditating every day, and I had done meditation. I'd done a lot of meditation in my life, but never every day. I'd just not been, organised enough, perhaps, to do that. So I thought, no, I need to do this. So what I was finding in that meditation was that this idea kept coming. It was just very, very clear to do a podcast, and it wouldn't go away. So at the end of that 3 weeks, I thought, well, I'm going to have to look into this, because this idea is really very clear. So I'm going to have to trust it and just kind of, scrape the surface, see what I can do. And so I just kind of looked up some free guides online and started creating the podcast. And it took me from March to November to get myself together and record 3 interviews, and then I released those 3 in the November in 2020. And I had no idea how it would be received, but it was just pouring through me. That's all I can say. It was like this, and I've always said this about this project, it's not coming from me, it's coming through me, without wanting to sound a bit silly, or that I'm anything other than a very normal person. I just really loved what I was doing, and it was like I had to almost kind of like step back and just let this take its own route. And this is exactly how it's always been and continues to be. So I don't really tend to make decisions about how it's gonna, what's gonna happen next. It just sort of shows me, if you like. And it might just be, even I don't particularly have themes, and I think, oh well, for the next 6 months I'm going to focus on this theme. I just start getting emails from people about particular themes, and it sort of just tends to work like that. So yeah, that's kind of how it came about, and I just feel very honoured to be doing this.
It was incredible. I can remember coming across it, and the picture you've got of the gnome's face came up on my podcast feed, and I can remember listening to it, thinking, well, "What's this going to be about?" And I was sort of enraptured by it almost from the first off. And within a couple of weeks, I bought Marjorie Johnson's book, and I was really fascinated by all things fairy, if you like. I'm someone who's always told stories about the Fae. We've talked about my own experiences in the past, and you've alluded to often having the fairies in your mind, and as a child when you were in Jersey, etc. I know you've had your really quite extraordinary fairy experience, which you've talked about on your podcast, and people can hear there. Prior to that, did you actually believe in fairies, or seeing fairies, or knowing fairies, or did you see them as just a figment of your imagination, or stories, or dreams really before that?
Yeah, it's really funny. At the point when I did have a fairy experience, I did not believe that you could see fairies.
Mhm.
I had been, as I say, into kind of esoteric stuff. I'd learned healing. I was practicing healing. Um, I was into all kinds of things, seeing auras, which I still see very easily, and it's a very simple thing to be able to learn. It's not difficult at all. So I was kind of really accepting of other realms and other states of awareness and all of that. But I remember the woman that taught me a lot of these skills, these techniques, healing and whatnot, and seeing auras. Um, she had once said, just casually during a break in one of the workshops I used to attend, that she'd seen a fairy, and I just thought that was completely ridiculous, and I couldn't actually work out why she was saying that because it couldn't possibly be true. So why she's saying it? It really flummoxed me. Um, and then it, yeah, I had my own experience, and once that happens, there's no going back. Then there really is no going back. I mean, I think the year before that, I had gone to a healing workshop in which I'd had this life-changing experience, and that was, I think, probably partly responsible for, you know, my opening, as it were, to be able to have that experience with seeing a fairy, because my life and my perspective on the world had shifted so entirely from that healing experience that yeah, it switched, it flicked a switch, and that was that. So um, at that time, no, I definitely didn't think it was possible. So I can relate to folk that just can't quite get their head around it. I do understand that it is hard to get your head around that.
But it's amazing that the people who come on your show, and some of them with stories that are quite incredible, and you deal with this in such a non-judgmental way, which is what I love about it so much, is that you always take the story as it is, and you put in a bit about your own experience. You listen to what the people have to say, and this is why there's so much respect for you from the guests as well, I believe. Um, the show has been going for a number of years now, and I've just seen it grow and grow and grow, and the guests coming forward seem bolder. The stories are changing. We've had loads of different special episodes. You know, one about seeing Santa Claus, or hearing the bells ringing and things like that. Where would you like to see it in maybe 5 years' time? I know you've got this ongoing fairies project.
Yeah.
Where would you like to see it, and how? Um, will it? Is it something that you will keep going for a long period of time?
I honestly don't know. And from the beginning, I said that this would continue as long as I felt I kind of had permission to do it, if you like. I go, and that is from the other world, the the fairies. I, I I'm not saying that I have like a, a constant conversation or anything like that, but I go out and I will meditate, and I will just open to a sense of, is this okay or not? And I receive, and I trust what I receive back. And anybody can do this, as I say. It's just opening and trusting what you receive. So as long as it feels right, then I will continue. I have no idea what it would be doing in 5 years' time. And I just, yeah, I wouldn't like to say because it just really depends where it wants to flow. I mean, at the moment, I'm writing a book, and even that was quite a big decision to take because, I'm sort of juggling all the podcast and family, and at the time work as well. But I've switched to doing the podcast as my job now. So it's kind of, on the one hand, you haven't got your day job, but on the other hand, this is now your day job, and probably, you yeah, it's all encompassing. So to write the book, I need to, sort of make space for that too. So it's quite tricky to sort of to find the balance. But I think that, the stories that people are sharing are so inspiring, and I agree they have actually kind of developed in a way. I've seen a big shift from when I started out to now. A lot more people talking about these subjects, talking about their experiences, particularly fairies, and that's great to see. I think that, we've all been through a tricky time, and it feels like it's important to just speak our truth. Simple as that. That's what I feel anyway.
That's great,
Yeah.
Jo. That's fantastic, and long may it continue, and long may it be that safe space for people to share their stories. And it's one of the most inclusive podcasts I know, where people actually come and can tell their story, no matter what that may be, and it's sort of universally supported by the listeners as well, which is lovely. And I've had the pleasure of meeting some of your Patreon followers and telling them stories as well, and they seem such nice people as well.
They really are. Yeah.
We The night starts to grow dark and the shadows are lengthening here. And when you arrived, you said there was a story that you'd like me to tell. Do you want to tell the listeners what that story is and why you've chosen it for tonight?
Yes, I would. So this story is from Dermot McManus's The Middle Kingdom. It was actually first, people might know it as Irish Earth Folk as well. So it was published in 1959. And this story is the Lis Ard Spell. And this is about a young woman. So Dermot McManus is from Kiltimar in County Mayo. And the stories that he collected were all from the people that lived around, where he lived. These were all people that he knew, or friends of friends. And they were all kind of still alive at the time, because he wanted to make it so that if anybody wanted to go and check these stories out, they could. And yeah, so this story is about a young woman who is just on her first independence from leaving home. She's gone to work in Dermot McManus's auntie's estate, a grand house in Kiltimar. And Lis Ard means high fort. So this is a hill, a fairy fort. And it was, a local, you know, beautiful spot that she decides to go and walk up to. And she gets what we might call pixie led. It's sometimes known as the stray sod in Ireland and other places. And it's just, I mean, I don't know how much time we've got left to before you introduce the story, but what I find really fascinating about this is that some of the aspects of the story we see in the stories that people come and tell on the podcast, that it's this kind of liminal state. She's moving from childhood to adulthood, and then she's up there in this fort and the atmosphere changes, and it becomes reality shifts for her, which is something that we see quite a lot. And she's physically unable to leave this place. So it's quite a creepy story. And I think, the Dermot McManus, he entirely believed this, what these stories that he wrote about, and I think he did a really great job of gathering some excellent encounters and presenting them in a very sort of no nonsense way, which I really like. And you get to hear this account, and what's interesting also is the way that she then does manage to get back to the estate, and the people there are willing to accept her story too. So that's the kind of, there's a sort of a bit of a sad shift there between that culture in 1959, which was already changing a lot, but now we're sort of 60 odd years later, and how many people would actually believe a young woman that had gone missing, believe her story that she'd been kept up at a fort by the fairies these days. But I think what's interesting, he says at the end of the story that no reasonable person could doubt her story. And I like to think that people that listen to my amazing guests that come on my podcast and tell their stories would say the same. When you actually hear someone's first-hand story, no reasonable person could doubt it once you've heard that from the horse's mouth.
That's great, Jo, and I can't wait to tell it. And just before I ask you to just sit back, relax, and listen to a tale traditionally told, can I thank you ever so much for joining me here at the Firepit at the heart of the forest. Jo Hickey Hall, the host of the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, which you can find wherever you get your podcast. When can we expect the book, Jo?
Oh, well, now you're asking. I think sometime next year, I think now. Yeah, sometime next year. And I look forward to sharing that with you, Owen. And thank you so much for having me on. And thank you for your amazing podcast too, which we absolutely love. And my husband is a huge fan in particular. So I think this is the interview that he's been most excited about that I've done. So
that's
so
great.
Thank you so much.
No problem at all. And just please keep on the podcast, keep pushing on, keep listening to what the fairies tell you, really, and get it out there, because it's so amazing and it brings so many people together. And if anything, you're a Marjorie Johnson for the 21st century here, because you're gathering all these tales from all over the place and putting them together somewhere where everyone can listen to them. And I think that's something you can be really proud of, Jo.
Thank you so much. What a huge compliment. Thank you.
So sit back, relax, close your eyes, and let us hear the Lis Ard Spell. The Lis Ard Spell by Dermot McManus, read by Owen Staton. In 1935, my aunt, then the occupant for life of our family home in Mayo, required a companion help for her nurse housekeeper. With some care, she chose a very nice, intelligent and steady girl of 19, B.M., who came from a respected family of prosperous small farmers in the little townland of Meelick, about 3 or 4 miles away to the north. This girl had never left home before, and so, under my aunt's meticulous care, her life continued to be sheltered and controlled. She was introduced to 3 or 4 of the leading local farmers, all ex-tenants and family friends and supporters of ours for many generations, and her visits were restricted to them. Particularly included in this select list was a very respected family of the nurse housekeepers under whose immediate charge the girl was. One Saturday, after her first 6 or 7 weeks at the big house, having the afternoon off, she decided to spend it with the Solons, the housekeeper's family. As it was a bright, sunny day, and she was feeling rather homesick, she thought that she would climb Lis Ard, the famous fairy fort, which was less than 1/4 of a mile behind the house and not much out of her road to the Solons. From it she could look across the country and see the roofless round tower of Melech. She was to be back in the house by 7 o'clock, in time for the evening meal and long before darkness would set in. But at 7 o'clock she had not returned. And then, at 8 o'clock, there was still no sign of her. A messenger was dispatched to the farm. He soon returned with the alarming news that she had never been there, and it did not take much longer to get the same replies from all the other cottages in the neighbourhood. Then indeed the alarm became serious, and as by this time it was dark, several search parties provided with lanterns were at once organised to scour the surrounding country thoroughly. The search was prosecuted vigorously for 7 hours, and not till 11 o'clock and midnight did the various parties come back to the big house, having then abandoned their efforts as hopeless. Only a few minutes after the last party returned, B.M. walked herself through the open door and collapsed on a settee, where she burst into tears. It was clear the poor girl was in a state of utter exhaustion and nervous strain, but she was young and healthy, and with the warmth of a kitchen fire and a good hot cup of strong tea soon made her all right again. The story she had to tell was astonishing, and the neighbours listened spellbound as she unfolded her adventures, the lilt of her soft country voice dominating the room. It seems that on her way to the Solons she had walked off as had planned to the left axis of the fields to the foot of Lis Ard. All went well as she climbed its steep slopes, clambered over the surrounding bank, crossed the ditch, and made her way through the beechwood covering its centre, till she reached the summit. It was a lovely summer's day, and she stood and looked between the trees out and across the country to admire distant Nephin, rising its majestic and solid bulk away to the northwest. Then her eyes wandered nearer home until she saw due north the roofless round tower of Melech, till recently the centre of her youthful life. Though she could not make out for certain her own home, yet all the distant features, woods, bogs, and hillocks, were plucking at her heartstrings. For some time she gazed at them. Then she looked down beneath her at the small farms and cottages nestling snugly by their lanes, one of which was her new destination. She followed with her eyes the winding back avenue as it passed field and wood till it merged into the road which led to these small, tidy farms. She felt a little chilly now, though it was early summer. Her thin new frock, a nice red shot silk one, sent to her by relatives in America, was no protection from the cool hill breezes. So she walked down gaily towards a gap in the outer bank, and as she reached, an incredible thing took place. She had just got to the opening when she felt a queer kind of jerk, a muscular jerk, inside her rather than from the outside, and before she realized what had happened, she found herself walking quickly in exactly the opposite direction towards the centre of the wood again. It was a moment or two before she could collect her wits sufficiently to stop herself and turn back. As yet she had not the slightest idea of anything supernormal, but just smiled to herself at her silly mistake, as she imagined it to be, and started off again for the same gap. But when she reached it, exactly the same thing happened, and in exactly the same way. Then indeed astonishment seized her, soon giving way to fear. She stood for a few moments, looking about her and fighting back the panic rising in her breast, As she looked at the quiet, friendly wood around her and the smiling, sunny countryside beyond and beneath it, her panic left her, and she tossed her head and boldly stepped out again, this time making for the point on the bank where she had entered. She tried to climb over it here, and it looked quite easy, for the ditch was shallow and the bank was low. But now she received her greatest shock, for she felt as if an invisible wall was there, and she could not pass. Whether it was all just in her mind, or whether it was an invisible objective structure, she cannot to this day be sure. But it was nonetheless a fact that along that bank there was a line which she was quite unable to pass, even to stretch her arm across. She walked along the ditch to her right, her breath catching in deep gasps that were very near to sobs as she tried again and again to cross that eerie line, fortifying herself with an intensity of prayer, but all to no purpose. After stumbling along the ditch over the stones and roots for some distance, she stopped and turned back to the top of the rise. She felt strongly within herself that it would be fatal for her to sit down or lie down or to relax in any way before this unseen power. But she must keep herself alert and active, ready to take the first chance of escape without a moment's delay, or worse might well befall her. And now, the feeling of serene friendliness which she had felt before the surrounding fort left her, she sensed with an ever-growing intensity a feeling of hostility and personal resentment flooding towards her like an angry mountain stream in spate. It came, she was sure, from some point on the northwest edge of the fort, but beyond that conviction she was quite mystified. However, she kept as far away as she could down by the bank and gaps to the southeast, round the point where she had entered. At last the sun began to set and twilight came on, to be followed only too rapidly by the darkness of a moonless night, the utter impenetrable blackness which country people know so well. Like a wild animal in a cage, she kept moving up and down that stretch of ditch and probing the bank in a ceaseless effort to find a way through the magic wall which inexorably shut her in. Soon, coldness and tiredness added their weight to her distress, and at last she saw a lantern bobbing up and down in the distance. It came steadily nearer, and in a short time she could make out the figures of 3 or 4 men. As they came nearer, she still shouted and called at the top of her voice in a frenzy of hopeful excitement. They came nearer and nearer, and she could hear their voices calling. In answer, she hopefully thought to her own cries. They came up the hill and walked along outside the bank, waving the lantern and calling her name. Indeed, at one time they were not more than 20 or 30 yards from her. By this time she was standing on the high ground, just inside the ditch, in full view, while she desperately called to them. But they passed on, unable to see or hear her through that magic wall, standing invisibly between them. So they moved away, leaving her behind and still powerless in her invisible prison. It was too dark for her to move, except in great care, and as soon as this party had left, she could only return to her restless groping up and down the dry ditch, always looking for a way out. In this darkness, the time seemed indeterminable, the silent monotony only broken twice by the more distant sight of 2 other search parties moving along with their swinging lights. At last, another party appeared, moving past the bottom of the hill on its way back to the house. It was too far away for a hail, and she was looking at it wistfully, when suddenly She realized that the invisible barrier to her had disappeared. At once, without any further trouble, she clambered out through a gap and stood for a moment on the dark slope of the hill, exulting with thankfulness to heaven that she was now free. But she did not yet feel safe. So she had lost no time in following the lantern before her. Having to move gingerly in the dark, she could not overtake the party. No one heard her calls. So she gave up hailing and concentrated all her energies on getting down safely to the path that ran at the foot of the hill. Once on it, she lost no time, as well can be imagined, for making her way back to the house. No reasonable person listening to her could doubt her story, and though she was closely questioned, she never deviated once, even in a detail. Nor has she ever done since. No house had received her that day, for such a possibility was checked upon again and again. There could be no doubt at all about her physical exhaustion, which was inevitable after standing such long hours and in such distress. That her frock was quite clean, unstained and uncreased, was further evidence that she had not slept or rested anywhere.